Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG Podcast, episode number 157 of the show. I'm Ramon Mejia. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. And this week I have 6 new LitRPG reviews just so you folks at home. And this week I'm going to be reviewing Equalize, Ether Collapse book number 1. Then it's going to be Underworld, Sanctuary, LitRPG series. After that it'll be VampQuest. Then Legend of the Swordbearer Tempest, Chronicles book number 1. After that will be Djinn, Tamer, Starter, a monster battling game lit adventure, Djinn, Tamer, Bronze League book number 1. Long title. Then it is going to be Sacrificial Pieces, the game. This is the 3rd book in this series. Okay, before we get into that, we have a small LitRPG section, a new section, I should say. And in LitRPG news, we have one story. I'd say one story this week. Apollo's Thorn. He recently released the next book and the 3rd book in the Underworld series, which we're reviewing today. But to help promote it, he's actually doing a Kindle countdown deal where he's reducing the price of the 1st book in the series to $1.99 from the 11th of February to the 18th of February. The 2nd book in that series was also reduced temporarily, but it's already passed, so I'm not talking about that sale. But if you haven't had a chance to check out the story, book 1 is really good. It's quite entertaining. We gave it a good review, so definitely go check it out if you haven't had a chance to read that particular story. But we'll again be reviewing the 3rd book in that series on the podcast today, and that's kind of it. Also for authors, if you have promotional stuff that is actually, LitRPG news, like it's going to be happening, feel free to let us know at the podcast. We'll be more than happy to post about it because, readers like deals. And so it works out for everybody. So you can always send us that information at feedback@geekbitespodcast.com. Also, of course, you can always also send us information about your upcoming releases, things like that. We're more than happy to take a look at it and see if it's LitRPG and we can add it to the list somewhere. So there you go. Okay, on to stuff that is out now. Haven't had a chance to read them, though. Includes Demon Lords World Tree Trilogy, book number 2 by E.A. Cooper. Also out is Beta Life Digital Sorcery, book number 1. Also out is Viridian Gate Online Nomad Soul, written by DJ Bowden. Now, this is the first in the VGO expanded universe. This is again not written by James Hunter or Jay Hunter, who's the main author of that series with all those other characters. This is a separate series. There might be some cameos and stuff occasionally, but this is supposed to be a separate main character, separate adventures, separate storylines, set in the same universe with the same rules. And I know the James Hunter and Shadow Lapis have worked really hard to make sure the continuity is there, and that hopefully fans will be entertaining, and they could find, they'll find a stable continuity between those 2 series. But this is their first entry into from a number of series that they're actually planning to release, that are again almost expanded universe kind of stuff for the Viridian Gate Online series. So it is out now. Also out is The Good Guys book number 4 called For the Loot. By Eric Ugland. Looking forward to reading this one. Also out is Gemini's Crossing, a fantasy LitRPG game lit adventure, Enora Online book number 1. So there you go. Also out is The Dungeon Traveler. This looks like it's a dungeon core novel, so we'll have to see how that goes, but there are RPG stuff in there. Also out is Ghouls and Guns, as is the story Scramble Lives. That one's out as well. That's new. And the 2nd book in the Alternative World Online series called Volume 2. It's the exact same cover as Volume 1, which tells you the budget that the author seems to be working on as far as advertising. So we actually give book number 1 a good review, 7.1 or 2, if I'm recalling correctly. It was better than I thought it was going to be. So it's, book 2 is out if you've been interested in that series. In new LitRPG audiobooks, we have a couple of new entries as well, including Arcane Kingdom Online, The Chosen, by Jacob Tanner. That is out as a audiobook for you folks. This one I was actually more excited about. It was Changing Faces New Game Minus, book number 1 by Sarah Lynn. Really enjoyed book 1. Enjoyed book 2 a little bit better in this series. The book's got about 7.7 and a 7.8, if I'm recalling correctly in my head, for those review scores for those 2 books. Sarah Lynn, again, I've said it before, probably one of the top 5 new LitRPG authors from 2018 that I really enjoyed. So definitely go check out her audiobook if you're more of a fan of that kind of stuff. Also out is an audiobook is Breaking Ground, Halacron Rising by Stone Thomas. In upcoming LitRPG, this is just where I read off a bunch of stuff that I know is coming out in the near future because of pre-orders, because authors have told me, and they've given us cover art so we can show it off. And it's just a bunch of stuff. There are some new additions to the list, but feel free to skip ahead to the reviews if you like. On February the 15th, it'll be Scourge of Souls, The Realms, book number 4. This is the 4th book by C.M. Carney in his Realm series. Book number 4 in the Somna Online series is also going to be out on February the 15th, called Dissonance. On February the 17th, it'll be The Guardian Guild, the Dungeon Core Epic, Station Cores, book number 3. If you're a fan of the series, again, this is book 3 in the series. On February the 19th, it'll be Star Exile Singularity by Drew Cordell. On February the 21st, the latest novel from Portal Books, which is an indie LitRPG publishing company. They've had some good successes for some of them. Some of them like, oh, that's almost. But this is a new entry from them called Occultist Saga Online #1, a fantasy LitRPG. So see how that goes. It'll be out on February the 21st. On February 22nd, the 2nd book in the Apex Chronicles series, Hunter's Choice. This is more of, this is definitely inspired by Monster Hunter, that game series. So that'll be out on February the 22nd, though. On February the 22nd as well, it'll be His Staff, Skeleton in Space, book number 1. This is another entry from Mountaindale Press, which is Dakota Kraut's publishing company. He's been bringing on a ton of new LitRPG authors and new LitRPG series, including one we're reviewing today on the show. But this will be another entry from that particular company out on February the 22nd. It looks a little more horror-ish from the cover, so we'll see how that goes. On February 24th, it'll be Collide Everborn, book number 2 in that series. February 26th, Cat's Game, book number 1. February 26th, Firebrand, the Firebrand series, book number 1. This is again another one of those expanded universe series from Viridian Gate Online and Shadow Valley Press. Out again on February 26th. We got some cover art finally for the next Awaken Online, book number 4, Dominion. It'll be out on February 28th. There's no official pre-order yet, but we have some cover art here for you. So it looks kind of pretty. It looks a little smoky. But there it is. Out on March the 5th, it'll be the Black Turtle, The Atar Chronicles, book number 2. On March the 5th, this is actually a shift for this particular novel. It changed release dates. By Dave Wilmarth, The Dark Sun Survival. That's the name of the book. It'll be out again on March the 25th. Previously, it was the end of April. So there was a shift in release schedules. On March the 12th, it'll be Vindication, The Alchemic Weaponer. I got another expanded series, expanded Viridian Online series for their expanding universe. On March 15th, Quest for Roshlin, a fantasy LitRPG GameLit adventure. This is the 2nd book. Book 1 just came out this week, so the author's already putting a pre-order for book 2, which seems a little odd. March the 18th, it'll be Absolute Zero, Adam Online, book number 2. Again, this is from the author who's the co-author for the 2nd series in the Level Up universe, which is a Russian translation. So there you go. Out on March 25th, the 3rd book in the original Level Up series, The Final Trial. On March the 27th, it'll be Dark World Transformation, book number 2. April the 5th, it'll be the 2nd book in the Djinn Tamer series. Remember, we're reviewing book 1 on the show today. This is book 2. It'll be out on April the 5th. On April the 10th, Edge of the Abyss, Respawn Trials, book number 1. On April the 11th, the 5th book in the Good Guy series will be out on April the 11th again. On April the 16th, it'll be a new story called Soulcatcher, LitRPG series Universe ICS. Interesting title. On April the 18th, it'll be Dragonheart, Stone Will, a LitRPG. I'm not trying to say this word. It's always Wuxia or Wuxia, something like that. Series, book number 1. And April 22nd, it'll be Class A Threat, Discardium, book number 1, from the same author as the Level Up series. Dan. I'm just going to say Dan. On April 25th, finally, the 2nd book in the Galacticon series by Vasily Mohenko. It'll actually be out. Apparently, it's just getting translated at this point. It'll be out on April 25th, called In Search of Oldans. So there you go. Get that second book in that sci-fi lit RPG series finally. Fans have been waiting for that for a really long time. But we had to wait till Vasily Manko finished the Way the Shaman series and the other projects he was doing. So there you go. Okay, on to new releases and reviews. And in new releases and reviews, we're going to begin with Equalize, Ether Collapse, book number 1, written by Ryan Debrin. It is another title from Mountaindale Press. So that's Dakota Kraut's publishing company. He's been really hitting on the park with most of his LitRPG series that he's done and all the things that he's been publishing, getting new authors, like first-time authors a lot of times. So I'm always happy to talk about the stuff that company puts out. There we go. Put it back up. It is 570 pages, which is pretty beefy. $4.99, available on Kindle Unlimited, so very nice price point. Also available on Kindle Unlimited, though. And here's the author's description. Gaia has awakened, and the world will never be the same. Rockland Barclay has had a rough year. On top of everything else, his father has just passed, and Rocky has to go it alone on their annual trip. But his plans for drinking alone in Algonquin Park are rudely interrupted by a sea of cosmic energy that governs the universe. Ether, the driving force of creation, has returned. Now, a confused Rocky must navigate odd hovering messages to survive. With the awakening of their very planet they reside on, humans are in a desperate fight to survive in an evolving world. If only Gaia hadn't woken up so very, very unhinged. So there we go. Full disclosure, I received an advance copy for review. I purchased the novel when it became out. Now, technically, the novel's quite out, not out quite out yet. I'm reviewing this recording this on a Thursday. The book will actually come out tomorrow on February the 15th, but you get a chance to see if it's worth your time and money, and it definitely is. I'll be honest, the beginning of the story, though, it was a little hard to get into. The setup feels a little loose and also familiar. If you've ever read System Apocalypse, the setup is the start is a little similar. The main character in the beginning of the story was definitely a little annoying. And then for me, that was mostly because it's a weird character trait, but the main character curses a lot, but it doesn't actually curse. He uses like weird made up substitute words. And it's definitely a choice on the author's half. It's consistent. But I found it was a little, just personally, I found it was a little annoying. Like either curse or just don't. I'm like, just that in between thing is just annoying, and that's a personal thing. So the main character just personally was just a little bit annoying in the beginning of the story. That improves as the story goes on, bro. And if I'm honest, at the beginning of the story, some of the game mechanics kind of feel made up as the story goes on. And the beginning section of any literature series is usually an explanation section of what the game mechanics are, how they impact the story, how intricate they are, explanation of classes and stats and all that good stuff. But in this particular case, some of the numbers for me felt off, and they felt in a couple instances like, oh, these numbers don't match. But for the most part, if I just stopped taking it so seriously, once I did, I enjoyed it more. But again, and that's really mostly issues at the beginning of the story. The story absolutely gets better. It progresses, and once the main character starts interacting with other humans, and I'm not, yeah, okay, it's in the novel description. So the story starts out with the main character all alone in a forest when the RPG apocalypse happens, when Ether is unleashed and everything in the world shifts and monsters start spawning, and he gets the RPG blue box and his stat sheets and the character sheets and things like that, right? And so he's all alone. He has to fight monsters and stuff, and again, it's a very, if you read the System Apocalypse, you're going to find similarities to that beginning, but that's a lot. It's just similar to a lot of RPG apocalypse stories. But that beginning part, because the main character is by himself and he's just talking to himself, it's a little less engaging than I would have liked. But again, once you get other characters in there, once you get his interaction with other humans, I think that expands the story and fleshes out how that RPG apocalypse is affecting humanity. There's a little more opportunity for world building there. I'll say by the halfway point though, I was completely hooked in this, right? Like everything just came together by then, and the storyline really picked up and just kind of grabbed me. I was like, oh, and I finished the rest of that story in one sitting. I was like, oh, okay, it really like gets much better. Once again, the main character actually starts interacting with people, because part of the RPG apocalypse concept, at least for me, is not just, oh, you get to fight a bunch of monsters. It's how does that apocalypse concept, whether it's zombie apocalypse or some virus apocalypse kind of thing, mesh with the RPG mechanics, with the LitRPG portion of it, and so how that happens, how that occurs, usually doesn't show until you actually start interacting with other humans, other survivors, and you see how those two kind of genres mix a little bit, and so once that started to happen, like, oh, that's when it started to feel better and to come together a little more. The world building in the story is a little more on the fantasy side. Like, and again, I'm going to keep making this comparison because the System Apocalypse by Tao Wong is definitely probably one of the most widely recognized LitRPG apocalypse stories. And that one is a little more on the sci-fi side, even from book one. This one tends to lean a little more on the fantasy side, which is where it's differentiating itself, especially towards the beginning of the story. Eventually, it gets into a little more like guns and sci-fi stuff, but that's a little more towards the middle and end of the story. But even then, it doesn't get like super duper into it as much as like the System Apocalypse series definitely does. But again, if you like this apocalypse stories, you're probably going to like this. So I'm making the comparison because I think fans of that series will also like this one as well. And so that's definitely a plus because I like that series. I like this one as well. The story, again, has several commonalities. Again, it's not just with the System Apocalypse, but also with the RPG apocalypse kind of sub-genre in general, is that the earth is transformed by a sudden flood of mana, or in this case ether, causing monsters to spawn, dungeons to grow, land masses to shift, and people to gain access to a system store, blue screens, and RPG progression. That's kind of the core basis of what an RPG apocalypse story is, at least for me, of the ones that I have read. But again, it's also still set in the main modern world. So how those things impact our modern societies, modern cities, modern cultures, does vary a little bit because, again, we're not talking about a fantasy setting necessarily or like a far-flung sci-fi future. It is usually just modern Earth that has been transformed, and so you're still going to get a lot of modern conventionalities that are changing. And that's where the apocalypse kind of concept comes into, like, oh, how do these sudden shifts in the world impact people who are used to our everyday, lifestyle of like going to work, driving every day, and having water access and cold storage, refrigeration. And whenever any kind of shift happens in a kind of apocalypse story, whether it's zombies or viruses or whatever, how those services break down and how they impact society and how people are suddenly different because they're not just people in the community, they're survivors looking to take care of their families or themselves or whatever the case is. And like a lot of those apocalypse stories in here, it's not always the monsters that are the biggest step, but like the surviving humans as well. And I think that this one did that well eventually, and once you get other people besides the main character in the story. There's a lot of good action in the story, interesting RPG class abilities for the main character, and a little bit of town building. I don't think there are essentially like two smallerish sections in the story that expand on that a little bit. I think that's going to be something that's built up more in book 2 in the series, but there was a little bit of that here. So for me, had a good time with it. Gets a score of 7.7 out of 10. That's Equalize, Ether Collapse, book number 1. It'll be out on February the 15th. Gets a score of 7.7 out of 10. Had a good time with it. Okay, next, it is going to be Underworld Sanctuary, a LitRPG series by Paulos Thorne. It is 400 pages, $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. After coming face to face with death, Loran and company have found a dungeon to call their own. They fought hard to earn a stint of peace, but Nistrish Nava is still out there and her captain is now on the hunt. The impending arrival of the army of the Minotaurs will be the greatest threat that they have faced thus far. With their newfound freedom comes a myriad of additional dangers. They're running low on food, the dungeon is in disrepair, and they must find new hunting grounds to continue growing in power. As their chosen leader, Loran is faced with an impossible task. Will he weaponize their dungeon, develop his party's strengths, or seek ancient power from long-forgotten depths of the Underworld? So there you go. Full disclosure, I received an advance copy for review. I purchased the novel when it became available. This story is actually doing really well. It came out a few days ago, and it is already in like the sub 200. So it's like 190, 180 as the time of this recording of the podcast, but it's doing really well with fans. And the third book in the Underworld series keeps all the action and the RPG leveling that readers have come to enjoy from the series, and it adds base building, lots of training, crafting, shape-shifting, and even crop growing. The majority of the base building stuff, training, etc., I should warn you, doesn't show up till like that. The second half of the story. So if you don't be disappointed if you don't see much of that development until then. I think there were some fans who were like, oh, no, this is going to be a dungeon core story or dungeon master story. Not really. It's more of a base building story. Like even though it is a dungeon, and that possibility existed, the author chose to develop more like a base building more than a dungeon master story. Because even though they do attract monsters and they fight them, it feels like they're attracting waves of monsters to murder them for levels and stuff. So just be aware of that. The first half of the story is mostly just like good action adventure stuff with a little bit of resource gathering, which is going to be more familiar to books 1 and 2 in the series. And then the second half is a lot of like training, base building stuff. And if you're not into base building stuff or like town building things, that second half of the story might feel like a drag because it's like all squished together for a good section of the story, with like an occasional breaker for like some small action scenes or interpersonal conversation between group members. But it really is like squished. And so if you're not into that kind of stuff, you're not into town building stuff, that second half of the story might feel a little, like it drags a little bit. For me, I like it. I like that kind of stuff. I really enjoyed seeing how the main character trains, how he develops his new shapeshifting abilities, how he develops the town building stuff in the dungeon, how that goes and everything, and how that was a lot of experimentation with powers and things like that. It's kind of cool. So it was good for me. Gets a score of 7.6 out of 10. That's Underworld Sanctuary LitRPG series with a score of 7.6 out of 10. There we go. Okay, next story is going to be VampQuest by Addison Runberg. It is 144 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. It's a little expensive for the page count, but here's the author's description. Trapped. Aker is playing a fully immersive virtual reality video game called VampQuest, but he can't quit, and he doesn't remember his real life. He starts to raise level and enjoy the perks of being a vampire in a game world mostly full of humans when a rival guild attacks. The battle leaves Aker bitter and bent on revenge. He completes many missions that take him far from the guild's base, but vows to return and bring peace when he is strong enough. Can Aker defeat his enemies? Will he ever escape from VampQuest? So there you go. This is a trapped in a game story where the main character also has amnesia and is turned into a vampire within the first few minutes of him arriving in this RPG world. That's kind of the premise. That's how the story begins. Honestly, I was kind of intrigued by the idea of a little bitty vampire story. I like that concept. I've played some really great vampire RPG games before, like Vampire the Masquerade and Vampire, VAMPYR, both really great RPG vampire games. And so those games do some really amazing stuff in world building. They create interesting settings. They have the inherent moral conflict of taking human life to live. Plus, they just have some really cool RPG vampire powers. That's cool to like level up and see the different skill trees you can do and how you can fight and explore the world and using different modes, whether it's stealth or straight combat or evil and good light size, whatever the case is. But they do a lot of like cool things. Disappointingly, however, this novel is nothing like those games. And I mean, maybe this is just me, that I had a high expectation because I played those games, and this definitely disappointed in that respect. Instead, the story is more of a bland and predictable MMO story where the main character follows a series of chain quests. Like even like the novel description kind of tells like, oh, he follows a bunch of chain quests to deal with this rival vampire guild. And that's essentially what the story is. It really is just so much chain quests. And some of those little quests are like, they're okay. Like, and some of them are bad. And some are just like, oh, that was like a nice little nugget of a story or a little nugget of a quest. But that's kind of what it is. The main character himself is unremarkable. He doesn't remember anything about his life, which you would think would give him a free slate to be as evil as he wanted potentially with his character story. But instead, the main character just decides to be a goody two-shoes and wants to save all the humans from the vampires who are abusing them. But there's really no fundamental moral basis because he doesn't have a past. It's just like, oh, I feel like I should be good. And that was annoying in a way because I expected more, I guess, because of those other vampire RPG games, and which is unfair to the author. But I saw the potential for like some really interesting storylines here, and some really interesting explorations of morality as a RPG vampire, basically, and none of it was ever fulfilled. And again, that's partly on me, in that I guess I had higher expectations for this potential storyline. But there's also no setup for that particular personality trait from the main characters. Like if you literally have no history, you have no memories of anything in your past, and you're kind of a blank slate, it doesn't make sense that you would have like a set moral compass this hard to like the good side. You know what I mean? And there's really no moral ambiguity for the main character in a lot of the things that he does. And so that just really resonated with me. This is not necessarily a bad story. It just didn't feel special. It doesn't really take advantage of the modern world setting in the MMO RPG world, or the vampire aspect, at least to me. It's not bad. I mean, dialogue is really stilted in the beginning portion of the beginning of the novel, but after the 30% of the story, even that gets a little bit better. It's the story on the whole is just like, oh, okay. It's just kind of like meh for me overall, even though with the cyberpunk ending, which I thought was a little forced, it never really engaged with me, and that's kind of what it comes down to. It reminded me of kind of like this bland MMO that I wouldn't subscribe to after the first free month, basically. And that's kind of how I feel about it. So there we go. It's a score of 5 out of 10, which is kind of like meh, a little bit boring at some points. And again, part of that is on me, in that I had it going into this like higher expectations for the story, so that it didn't fulfill. And the other part is just like, oh, this is just kind of a blandish MMO world, which that never really grabbed me. So it's VampQuest with a score of 5 out of 10. There we go. Next, we have Legend of the Swordbearer Tempest Chronicles, book number 1, written by Jeremy Fabiano. It is 324 pages, $5.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. Stevie's days are numbered. The illness has consumed him. Would this stranger's offer give him a second chance? It looks like a game. Looks can be deceiving. Paul Nelson, the CEO of Tempest Inc., has developed another world, and he's ready to send in another consciousness. This time, though, things are different. Those that came before it caused some trouble, and his world is in peril. For Steve, it's a last chance. He's got nothing to lose, and who knows, it might even be fun. As a warrior named Abelanius, his body gone, Steve must adapt, learn, and grow to survive. But this world isn't exactly as advertised. There's a darkness coming, and it looks like fun will have to wait. And there's a secret nobody wants to talk about. Will Steve pierce together enough to live? There we go. And that's the end. This story actually sells up pretty good. Like, honestly, the first 35% of it is actually really like decently good. It starts out with a nice RPG system, levels, stats, character sheets, items, and item descriptions and ability descriptions, all the good quenchy stuff. The main character's in the game world by the 3% mark, so it's a really quick transition from dying in real life to getting an offer to upload his brain to the MMO and doing it and actually being there in the world. And the story from then on is a little essentially slice of life. Like the main character is supposed to be getting this quest to there's like some cybersecurity thing happening, but doesn't really actually play out in the story. Instead, it's like the slice of life story where he goes on adventures, gets on simple quest, and gets enough XP to hit level 3. And that's essentially the first 35% of the story. And like I said, it's for me, it was actually good. It really was. But at that 35% mark, the story seems to shift a lot. Like the entire RPG progression system disappears, which is like really weird, at least for me. Like the author put in the time and effort to like develop it, to keep track of stuff, and then it feels like at about like the 30-40% mark, the author just like, oh man, this is way too much work to keep track of this RPG stuff and levels and things, and he just gives up on it, because for the rest of the entire novel, the main character never levels again. Even though he completes like a ton of quests, kills a bunch of monsters, you never see the word level again. Like you never see any more monster levels. You never see any more examination of their characters or players or monsters and see, oh, this guy's level 3 or level 5 or whatever. That entire aspect literally disappears from the story. There are still a few like game-ish aspects of it. Like you see notifications, and you see some item descriptions or powers or whatever, but the RPG progression system is completely and 100% abandoned from the story. Instead, the story kind of shifts to more of this fantasy story where the main character is the chosen one suddenly, the sword bearer destined to beat back the necromancer. She wanted to destroy this world. And the story becomes much more wand wavy. The main character gains a lot of power that he doesn't earn. Like literally, the main character, and this is he gains level 3 in the story, and that's kind of the last you see of levels. But even then, like his stat points are like, oh, he gains 3 points in strength every level because he has a warrior class, and he gains like a 1 in everything else. And then suddenly he gets this ring who gives him a plus 25 to his strength, which is the equivalent of like what is that, like 7 levels, 8 levels. And I'm like, oh, that's completely unearned because he literally just as a drop in the story. I'm like, oh, that's annoying. And again, a lot of things happen in this round where he gains a ton of power that he literally didn't earn, or he does, but again, that's the side point. He also gets saved by a bunch of outside forces and not by himself. And so for some reason, this is like a recurring joke, I think. He gets knocked out a lot by bad guys, but he's never murdered by them. He's never killed by them, even though some of these bad guys are players, and they're like, oh, if we murder this guy, we can totally get away with our super evil plan. We literally have him by, he's literally invulnerable, but we choose to not kill him, even though he's literally staying in front of us for hours and hours. And I'm like, oh, that's a thing that occurs in fantasy stories, but not necessarily in LitRPG stories when there's like this, respawn system, so that's less common to see with LitRPG. Honestly, for me, I was super bored once I realized that the RPG progression system was abandoned after the 35% mark. And again, it really does just feel like the author got tired of tracking RPG progression, which I totally get. It can be a pain in the butt to keep track of. But why write the LitRPG story for and develop the beginning of like the mechanics when you're not going to and just not keep track of it? It doesn't make sense to me, and it kind of it made the story super less interesting to me once I realized, oh, the RPG stuff really just disappears, and this is a fantasy story now, to a degree. And again, so there you go. For me, score 5 out of 10. I would probably get lower, except again, the first 35% of it is legitimately good. And it's just like after that, there were some choices made. And that was the part that was unentertaining for me. But because there are still notifications, there's still ability descriptions, there's still like some item description with like stat points occasionally. It's not getting necessarily a negative score because, like I said, it's kind of this weird mix of like, oh, the beginning's LitRPG, the rest of it has game mechanic or like GameLit elements of like notifications, so I can't quite say it's not LitRPG entirely, but for me, just got bored. Scored a 5 out of 10. Legend of the Swordbearer, Tempest Chronicles, book number 1, with a score of 5 out of 10. There we go. Okay, next, Djinn Tamer Starter, a monster battling GameLit adventure, Djinn Tamer Bronze League, book number 1. Long title. Written by Derek Allen Sidaway and A.J. Cerna. Okay, this one is 323 pages. It is 99 cents. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Fans of Pokemon, Digimon, and Monster Rancher will love this monster battling take on the GameLit genre. Jackson Hunt wants nothing more than to be a professional monster tamer, skilled trainers who raise and battle magical creatures called Djinn. He longs for the day when he comes of age and can leave home to pursue his dreams of taming Djinn. Unfortunately for Jackson, dreams and reality don't always coincide. To help his grandmother make ends meet, Jackson spends his days doing manual labor on a breeder's ranch, just about as far removed from the bright lights and roaring crowds of the Djinn Battle League as it gets. But no matter how hard Jackson and his granny try, it's never enough. Facing bank foreclosure, Jackson is desperate to save his home but has no idea how, until he discovers a young, untrained Djinn left behind for him by his dead mother. As time runs out, Jackson works tirelessly to raise and develop a bond with his Djinn, but monster taming isn't as easy as the pros make it look. Along the way, Djinn and his friends will delve into the shady world of underground fighting, experience the agony of defeat, and learn what it takes to be a true monster tamer. Will Jackson and his Djinn level up fast enough, or is his dream destined to die before it even truly begins. So there we go. Not a bad novel description. It actually captures the majority of the storyline points for the story. As of this review, the novel actually has several like really positive reviews that say it's a good young adult reading and that fans of Pokemon will appreciate it. And I think those are true statements, but none of the reviews talk about the RPG mechanics in the story. They never talk about it as a LitRPG. And the story in itself, the author messaged the podcast and me and asked like, oh, is this going to be a LitRPG story or is this GameLit? And we talked about it essentially for a little bit, and this is absolutely story. There's character stats, and I'll get into that a little bit, and like stats and cheats and progress and advancement, all that's there. But the author was also kind of hedging his bets and saying, oh, we're going to go with the GameLit qualification. But honestly, none of that RPG stuff is ever talked about in any of the other reviews, so I'm going to be talking about it here. However, the novel on the whole doesn't really work for me as an adult. I think the reviews that talk about it as being a good young adult novel and having, elements of like Pokemon training and monster training and taming and fighting, all that is true. I think those aspects are done decently well. But I think at the same time, those aspects of the things, or some of those aspects are things that didn't work for me as an adult, because the novel really does seem like it's geared towards a younger audience, and kids in general, because it's the main character seems like he's a kid, even though he's supposed to be like, I think 16 or 17 in the story. The character comes off as being much younger, like in the neighborhood of like 10 or 11, at least to me. And you can tell the story is geared more as a coming of age story. The main character is like Ash from the Pokemon animated series, where he's like, oh, he's trying to be an adult and he's helping around the house. But it feels like that's the perspective that the story is being told from, and the storyline kind of feels a little predictable in that it's that coming of age story. The main character has a goal of saving his family house by becoming a good Djinn trainer, and also reconciling the issues he's had since his mom's death. So those aspects of the storyline are actually done decently well. Like the backstory for the main character with his mom's death and his relationship with his grandma, really nice actually. I actually like that part the best. I'd say on the game mechanic side, this is more of a light LitRPG story. The humans in the real don't have RPG mechanics. The RPG mechanics come when you come to the monsters, and I'll be honest, this is part of the thing that bugged me, was that the monsters' names are Djinn, and for me that word DJINN, it always refers to like genies in a bottle to me. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so every time I hear that word, it conjures up something besides what this story is trying to make it, and so that's part of the issue for me. But I forgot what I was going to say. But those creatures, the Djinn, they're the ones with the character sheets. They're the ones with stat pages and levels, and they level as they beat monsters, and they get more levels, and they can actually have there's actually a development system where the monsters get or there are a couple game mechanics, and that one, each monster has an element or several elements associated with it, that they're and those elements have weaknesses to other elements or strengths against other elements. So this rock paper scissors mechanic of like of those elements being stronger or weaker against other elements and Djinn. In addition, that the monsters have powers that can be upgraded, or they can use their development points to increase their stats or get new abilities or whatever the case is. And so there's that's essentially the RPG progression system, and it's consistent. You see it throughout the entire story. And so this is LitRPG. However, that RPG progression system, because it's applied to just the monsters themselves and not the main character, it feels a little lighter, because you don't see it as often as you would in a more traditional LitRPG story, where it's the trainer or the human who has the RPG progression system, who's always looking at it constantly, trying to min-max, or you get the main character talking to himself and saying, how do I want to develop my character? Instead, it's a little more focused on the story focuses more on like the YA young adult coming of age journey in the story, and that's kind of the focus of the story. Personally, I think the authors did a good job of trying to translate the monster battle concept to a novel, but it didn't work for me on several levels. As an adult, it was really hard for me to connect to it. And again, this is just not the author's choice, and that it really seems to be geared more towards young adults, or like children, young adults kind of concept there. And so the main character felt a little too young and immature for me to connect with. It's also really challenging to translate the visual anime stylization of capturing monsters and making them fight for themselves and others without it feeling weird conceptual. Like, I knew that when the author contacted us talking about like, oh, I'm going to do like this Pokemon book. I knew it was going to be a challenging concept to translate to a novel. One, because it's based on a beloved, several beloved series, like whether it's Pokemon or Monster Hunters or Digimon. Those are all have this very fantasy element, and because they're anime, there's already an exception that this is going to be a fantasy story, and that nobody's ever getting hurt in these series. Like, like you never expect any of the Pokemon to die or any of the Digimon to like have a permanent death. And so there's always that there's a different expectation to the story, and because the stylization of those concepts, you can accept the cultural concept of, oh yeah, we're sending children out to capture wild beasts and have them fight for our entertainment or for defense, right? But because it's an anime, that still works. What the authors here do is that they take that kind of concept and they try to translate it to a more realistic world setting. In that, and the basic premise is like, oh, what if Pokemon were real, and how would that work in our world, with a whole industry developing around this, and like a whole entertainment system, and actually having real battles, and how would that work as far as like, production and making money and things like that. And I think they do a good job of like translating into like a realistic setting, but at the same time, because they do, sometimes it was like, oh wait, you're really sending children out to capture wild animals and forcing them to fight your amusement. Like, that is interesting as a realistic concept. And in this world, like, the monsters can die and people can die from these monster fights. And that definitely changes, at least for me, like the way that I see this world, because it becomes a little too realistic in some respects. And you eliminate that high fantasy aspect. Like, oh, this is going to be okay. You know what I mean? And so, like I said, I knew it was gonna be challenging, and it didn't quite work for me personally. Also, again, the Djinn thing makes me think genies and not monsters. So the naming conventions were a little challenging too, especially the other monsters. Like, and again, this is think about translating a story or concepts from anime to like making them real for a novelization version of it. Even conceptually, like in the anime, is like you see a monster and it looks cute, and even though it looks super weird, you have a visual image you can connect to its super weird name. But if you just have written words in front of you, it's really challenging to create a consistent concept, like visualization of the monster based on like the weird description of it, or like its weird name. Like, for example, if you think of Pokemon, like Bulbasaur is like a really weird name, right? And it doesn't really tell you much about the monster itself. And if you were forced to describe the visual picture from the anime to people in the world, like, oh, it's kind of a lizard, but it's also partially a plant thing. It has this like growth on its back and tentacles or like vines to it, and keeping that description consistent and useful in a novel form is much more challenging than it is just like to show a picture of it in an anime, right? And so that was also part of the challenge for me, saying like, oh, visualizing what these creatures are and having connections to like this consistent thing. Like I said, this whole concept was super challenging as far as from a writing perspective. Even though I thought some of the powers the monsters use were neat, it was really just kind of challenging, like, oh, have a consistent visualization for all these different kinds of creatures, because the author really does have to start over for each kind of monster in describing it, naming it, and keeping it in the reader's mind as far as like being a consistent kind of monster. And you can't go too broadly, because then you have too many characters and too many kind of monster types to kind of keep track of. So it was a challenging project from the start. Overall, I give the authors all due credit for trying to bring something new to the LitRPG genre, but the story as a YA story was really kind of predictable. I struggled to stay interested in that aspect of it. The fights were actually okay. They were decently done. I think the translation of it to like this more realistic setting had its pros and cons, but it was the actual description of the fights actually good. But those elements aren't the main focus of the story. Like, the battles aren't them. I mean, they sort of are, and that's how the main character that's his goal. But like a lot of the story is like him dealing with his mom's death and his issues with his grandma, and like training and finding a trainer, and his own like coming of age kind of story. That's really the focus of the story. And this overall just didn't work for me. Like I said, I struggled to stay interested. I plan to still check out book 2 in the series. I'm hoping that it grows up a little bit, I guess, in some respect. This one just didn't work for me. So for me, it's a score of 5 out of 10. That's Djinn Tamer, a starter, monster battling GameLit adventure. Djinn Tamer Bronze League, book number 1 with a score of 5 out of 10. So there you go. Okay, one more, and then we are finished. It is Sacrificial Pieces, the game. This is the 3rd book in the game series by Cosmo Yap. It is 338 pages, $3.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. After failing to take down the United World Government, Alan is a wanted fugitive on Earth. With nowhere else to go, he leads the Black Rose Guild into the Abyss Labyrinth. But hidden agendas thrive within the Mercenary Guild, and Alan soon discovers larger forces at play. The game is a war for survival, and a solo victory is virtually impossible. Alan needs to pick a side, but what does winning even mean in the game? Will Alan just be another sacrificial pawn, or can he find a path to success? So there we go. This one is a little harder to describe for me. I just finished it like literally yesterday, and golly gee, I find it challenging to describe the last book in this first trilogy. And this actually wraps up a full arc in the series. At the end of the back material of this novel, the author says, "Oh, I consider this the end of the first prequel trilogy for the series." So I'm like, "Oh yay, more eventually." The author says he is taking a break from the series to write some other stuff and to improve his writing craft. And this definitely feels like an end of a solid arc there. So God, gee, without spoiling things for anybody, this has been like an amazing journey, full of good fights, good twists in the story arc, and literally a lot of twists in this last one. Good sci-fi adventuring, RPG leveling galore. And I gotta say that this novel is among the best and most entertaining LitRPG series I've ever had the pleasure of reading. Each book was a page turner that I spent reading till the wee hours of the morning, all in one sitting generally. And this one was no different. And boy, this story took some interesting turns that I did not see coming. And those twists and turns kept going to the very last page of the story. I was super, super engaged and super excited about the entire story, the entire time. This is the kind of story that once it was finished, I spent a good hour just sitting there thinking about it, and then just being amazed how good it ended, for me at least. It's a good story. I can't talk about the plot without spoiling this for people, because I think this is one of those instances oh, there's so many twists that even mentioning them is just going to ruin it for some people. But for me, it gets a score of 9 out of 10. I don't give those up very often, and this series has consistently gotten. I know I'm not sure if I gave all 3 books in the series 9 out of 10s, but I know I gave at least 2. And I think the other one might have gotten an 8 out of 10, which is that's the worst in the series. It gets an 8 out of 10 for me. But this has consistently been really just one of the most engaging, most crunchy, most interesting things in LitRPG, at least from my point of view. And I've enjoyed every single one. So easy review. Sacrificial Pieces, the game, book 3 in the series, with a score of 9 out of 10. And I can't wait to read anything else that the author writes at some point. That's it. So that's the show, folks. That last one was super easy, but it was definitely the most. That book got me the most excited. It got me the most engaged. And the end, I keep talking about it. I'm going to gush about it all day if you let me go. But the podcast is over. The reviews are done. Thank you, everybody. That's it for the show. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and YouTube, Patreon, on our webpage at LitRPGPodcast.com. If you want to support us on Patreon, it actually stands Geek Bites Podcast, which is the first podcast we did to write the Patreon for. But again, folks, if you want to support the podcast and help keep this podcast free and clear and free of ads, one of the easiest ways you can help support the podcast is to just click on the links. If you like one of the reviews we talked about, or one of the books we talked about, upcoming LitRPGs or things that are out now, you want to support the podcast and help send us some pennies from Amazon, essentially, click on those links. Those are called affiliate links. It doesn't cost you anything as the reader if you purchase something after clicking on those links, or you purchase the books there. But Amazon will send us a couple pennies for every $1 that you send, and helps keep the podcast essentially free, and helps cover our production costs. So thanks you folks for again listening and watching. If you want to find out any of the ways to support the podcast. You find out all the ways you do so at litrpgpodcast.com/support. Thanks for hanging out with me today, ladies and gentlemen. Anytime we can hang out again, remember to go read some Lit RPG. Goodbye, everybody.